And we're back. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Titans of Fantasy Football Podcast. It's been a bit. I think we did a kickoff episode after the season, kind of wrapping up predictions for free agency, but took a few months off, and now we're getting rip roaring ready to go for the new fantasy football season for 2023. But as always, I'm your host, Garrett Daigle. With me is Caleb Armstrong. And today we are going to be covering the offseason. And we're going to be covering the winners and people whose situations have improved since the start of the offseason. Caleb, any initial comments?
Nope. OTAs are finally, kicked off underway here. So season's officially rolling, I would say, which means fantasy season is officially rolling. You see a lot of, dynasty startups and best ball drafts going on right now. We're not going to cover too much into that, but we are, preparing you for mainly redrafts here and giving you guys some guys that we like who we think value mainly increase in the year, and then a couple guys who probably you'll see their ADP slip and drop, and the value decrease as well. So it's been exciting, long off season so far. Draft was great, not quite as crazy as last year, I would say, for an NFL draft, but still, it's exciting. A lot of polarizing prospects in this draft. Free agency was pretty big, like we expected. Saw some big contracts getting pushed out. Kind of quieter on the trading though this offseason. That's the biggest thing, I guess, is just it was quieter on the trade market.
Yeah.
So
I do feel like last year was a little bit of an anomaly on the trade front,
oh
both during the draft and during the offseason. Tons of players getting moved, and we saw some blockbusters in Russell Wilson and Deshaun Watson. We saw wide receivers getting moved all over, studs like AJ Brown, Amari Cooper. It was really kind of a whirlwind last year. Now this year, it was kind of we were playing catch up to that. We were kind of getting to the point where I think some more supporting players got moved around than anything. We did see the big blockbuster with Aaron Rodgers getting moved to the Jets. Anytime you have a Hall of Famer like that get moved on, obviously that's some big news. But that one was a long time in the work. So it took, pretty much anybody who's tuned in a little bit this spring, you're pretty aware of that one coming down the pipeline for a few months.
yeah. So well, with that, guys, we're not going to hit you a whole bunch with a lot of news right now because, most of you that are listening probably are keeping up to date with a lot of the NFL news in general. But we're just going to hit you guys here with a couple of our winners right off the bat. So, Garrett, I'm gonna let you start here with our draft winners. I know this guy. If you're not high on him, you're not a big fan of football, especially fantasy football. But we talked about some polarizing prospects. This guy might be one of the biggest prospects we've seen in years.
Yeah.
With
So,
that,
yeah, like you said, Caleb, what we kind of did here is we took a couple players that we thought landed in some good homes for the draft. So, you know, Caleb kind of led it on here. It's going to be Bijan Robinson for one of our picks. Bijan went 108 to the Atlanta Falcons, who had the leading rushing offense in the league last year. I think they led in both attempts and in terms of percentage of their offense being ran versus thrown. And if you look at this, it's really quite the landing spot for the draft's top running back. So Bijan kind of touted as the next Saquon Barkley-esque running back, somebody who has the entire tool set at their disposal. He can catch, he's shifty, he's big, he's fast, he's explosive, and really kind of a do-it-all type of guy. So we're back to the prototypical stage where you have a couple of these guys coming out, and it's like, all right, how high are they actually going to go in the draft? He's been touted even as a higher level prospect than guys that we've seen in Todd Gurley, Ezekiel Elliott, Saquon Barkley, all those guys who we also saw go at the top of the draft. So Bijan lands with the Falcons, who are a team with, a young talent in Tyler Algier, who did pretty well last year, but he was a later round pick. Bijan lands in kind of the perfect spot for fantasy because you want him to go somewhere where he's going to get the entire workload. He's going to get hammered the ball, and they're going to utilize his skill set. The Falcons are going to do just that. Their whole plan of attack is through the run game. So we know that he's going to get a monster workload right off the get go. I've seen some draft rankings already having him as a top 12, even a top 5 pick in redraft leagues this year. So every year it seems like there's a couple rookies that come off hot and flashing, and Bijan should be it this year.
Yeah, totally agree. Sorry, allergies are affecting me, but yeah, Bijan here, like you said, Garrett, perfect landing spot, and like you said, it's through the run game. Falcons ran the ball the most last year in the NFL. Tyler Algier, who you mentioned, was kind of honestly put together a pretty dang good rookie season, especially being a 5th-round draft pick, put up over 1,000 yards on the ground. You can see somewhat of a role for him still. It's not going to be big though. Like you use the 108 pick on a running back, you're going to use him. It's not like you're just going to let him, take a lion's share of the carry or whatnot. He's going to get all of it for the most part. But the thing with Robinson is, he was a dynamic pass catcher as well. And we've already seen little clips and stuff of him working on his slot game with, I can't remember who he was running routes with. I think it was Amari Cooper. I can't remember. Or not maybe somebody else. But he was working with a wide receiver on his foot and trying to get his routes down route right. And to be honest, the Falcons only have 2 guys in the passing game. So, and Kyle Pitts and Drake London are the only 2 real, I guess, guys who have kind of, a chance to be one of their top guys. Besides that, you got a little trickle in of Mac Hollins, and I don't even know who else is wide receiver 3 on that depth chart right now. But no, Robinson has a good chance to possibly snag 60 balls for you too, which is big in PPR leagues or half PPR leagues as well. So I like the landing spot there a lot, and like I said, we had a feeling he was going to go high in the draft. Capital says he does go 108. His chances of succeeding in the NFL and in fantasy in general, with being such a high pick like that, is a pretty good high percentage that he'll be, probably pretty decent of a football player. Especially towards fantasy, like you said, you see top 5. I've already heard, talks about him. Why shouldn't he go 101? What's the case against that? So, which I have a hard time drafting myself rookies that high, especially with like Justin Jefferson and Christian McCaffrey just being monsters. But there's a case that could be made. So going with another top pick in the NFL draft, guy who really didn't put together a great collegiate career, but was a freak when it comes to athleticism. Anthony Richardson goes 104 to the Colts, and had Gardner Minshew as the only other quarterback on the roster right now, really, that has any sort of a name, and has an easy path to week 1 starter, probably more than likely, especially being the 104 pick, and gets the coach that was the offensive coordinator for the Eagles last year, so now it's head coach, and comes in as the offensive coordinator for the Eagles. Jalen Hurts puts up MVP type candidate. And, Anthony Richardson is an athletic freak, just like Jalen Hurts. Probably a little bit better of a runner than actually Hurts is. And he comes into an offense not great in the weapons category besides, Jonathan Taylor behind him in the backfield, but in Michael Pittman being his wide receiver 1, not a whole lot of depth behind there that are, any name value right now. But, he has got a place here where he could grow and they can bring guys in around him, and already being a strong running game, his fantasy output for running alone could be pretty dang high. He could have almost like 700 yards on the ground and 7 touchdowns. It would not shock me. And plus whatever he does through the air. He doesn't have to tear it up through the air to be fantasy relevant because he has that rushing upside to his name. And landing in the Colts, who have a pretty solid offensive line in front of him, will also help him as well.
Yeah, and he's kind of he's absolutely an intriguing prospect. I shouldn't say kind of. The fact that he landed with the Colts and Shane Steichen coming back from the Eagles, like you had mentioned, he lands in an offense that's done. They've already done this before, right? So coming from Jalen Hurts, who was a second round pick, kind of showed some okay things, but he was far from a polished NFL starter last year before the season started. Had an MVP candidate type year, and now we're seeing a guy who's got better physical tools in
Yep.
Anthony Richardson, 6'4", 230, 240, depending on what he is that week. Runs faster than Jalen Hurts, and he's like a fast Cam Newton. He's got the same type of body.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, he did not have the best stats in there. He was far from polished in the college game. His passing percentage last year for completion percentage was just under 54%, which isn't the greatest. Only threw 17 touchdowns, but he has that dynamic way where if the ball's in his hands, he can go and make plays happen. So we saw Justin Fields do it last year. Really became a exciting fantasy player down the stretch last year through pretty much weeks. It was like 8 through week 12, I think. He was putting up just absolutely monster games, and then ended up as the QB6. So we look at what Anthony Richardson could do this year with the Colts. Got some decent supporting cast members alongside of him, a good offensive coordinator who's ran that type of system, and he's kind of poised for a situation where there's a lot of opportunity for fantasy success.
Yep. So going into our next category here, we're going to be talking about some of the free agency winners. And so some guys, um, we could really hammer on some of the running backs and for the losing aspect and the winning aspect of this free agency because, we talked all year last year at the end of the year about how this running back draft class coming in was going to be solid and how the free agency market for running backs was going to be deep. And, we're already seeing a lot of big names at currently the moment still sitting on that waivers and waiting to hopefully land home with some team. But one guy who put together a career year here, got a contract, goes to a place with not much competition behind him, and could really show what he did last year and carry it on to this year. So Garrett, why don't you let us know who that is?
Yeah, so our first guy here for our free agency additions, people who signed new contracts, is Miles Sanders. Put together a very very respectable, solid season last year. Um, it was his career season. Put up over 1,200 yards rushing, 11 touchdowns after having zero the season before. Um, Little contributions in the passing game, caught only 20 passes, but that's not really been something that has been a huge part of his skill set the last couple of years. His rookie year, he did have 50 catches, so he does. It's not like he doesn't have that ability. So we look at his situation. He moved over to the Carolina Panthers, where he signed a 4-year contract. In that running back room, they still have Chuba Hubbard, who has had flashes but hasn't been able to stay healthy. Deonta Foreman left and went to the Bears, and then they didn't add any other pieces of notable value in the draft. So why is this a good situation? Well, staying on the Eagles would have been great, but they added 2 other pieces, and he also needed to get paid. Money talks. So if this team shows that they paid him the money, it's most likely that they will also follow that up with giving him the rock. Another good thing, they walked away with this year's top quarterback in the draft, Young. So Bryce Young comes to the team, and expectations are pretty high, like any other first overall quarterback. So we have an offense that struggled last year and the years before with trying to get the ball rolling, especially pushing the ball downfield to their quarterbacks. Now they have an opportunity to reset and kind of build from the ground up. So Miles Sanders is going to be doing that. And, while we might not expect 1,269 rushing yards again, we can expect that he's going to be a bell cow back and that he's going to be given the first opportunity to have a really good, successful start to the season there.
Yeah, I like, I'm not usually too high on Miles Sanders, but, the way he carried himself last year, pretty much injury free, was finally finding the end zone compared to the years before. I think he had 10 or 11 touchdowns last year. Um, like you said, Gary, had some points there. There's not a lot of depth behind him. Adds a good young quarterback to add to the wide receiver room. I don't know if there are much dynamic pieces in the wide receiver room, but some added help because you lost DJ Moore, who has been a very good wide receiver in the NFL so far in his career, but really not much behind Moore last year, and now they add four pieces to the wide receiver room in general, and Thielen, Chark, Mingo in the draft, and then Hayden Hurst as well at the tight end room. So it could take away a little bit from the running game, but also the Panthers ran the ball a lot last year, so. Miles Sanders, do and looking like he'll be due for some, RB1 role there in the Carolina offense. So, all right, our second guy here on the free agency winner, you know, talked about all the tail end of last offseason. He was on the news like crazy. It seemed like he was like they were saying that he could potentially be um, milking his injury kind of to save himself for the offseason and get his contract, all this stuff. And it was Lamar Jackson. And, he gets paid. We knew he was going to get paid. Didn't know it was going to be by the Ravens. Didn't know if he was going to test free agency, what was going to happen there. The Ravens picked up his fifth-year option. And then the day of the NFL draft, hit the doozy that, we're signing him to a mega deal, multi-year. And what do they do for Lamar that they never done before? They bring in some weapons for him finally in the wide receiving room. Lamar really has never had, besides his tight ends, I guess you can say, has never had too much wide receiver depth there. They did draft Rashad Bateman 2 years ago, just has never stayed healthy really for the most part. Otherwise, the best prospects they've always brought in have been, well past their prime wide receivers for the most part, like Sammy Watkins.
Yeah.
And who was the one last year? Oh, Deshaun Jackson last year. And guys like that. Well, they bring Odell in off the street, kind of the same, same falling aspect there. 30 years old, got two and torn ACLs, but the last that we saw of Odell was, before the ACL injury, kind of came back to his old self in the ways of with him LA Rams. If he is truly healthy, that's a big option there. But then they use another big pick early in the draft, was about 20, I think it was, and they bring in Zay Flowers. He was one of the top prospects in the draft for a wide receiver. Super fast, had good, tested out well, better charts, and kind of just helps mold that offensive room there with Bateman, um, Odell Beckham Jr. and Flowers, and then of course Mark Andrews as well. So Lamar there finally has more than one, I guess, off wide receiver you can finally say. So that's just bigger than what he's had in the past, and he can actually work with something now a little bit. It seems like so. He's one of our big winners because got paid, got an offense that he can work with finally, and we've seen Lamar obviously in 2020 put the MVP type candidate together, and he's always got that rushing upside going with him as well.
Yeah, I think one other major thing to highlight is that they changed offensive coordinators as well. So they hired Todd Monken to run the offense, giving them kind of a fresh new start. Caleb, you mentioned, them having issues in the wide receiver room. It's always been lack of depth. So they'll take these first round shots on a wide receiver like Hollywood Brown, Rashad Bateman, but there's no depth behind them. And it's just all these old old dusters that are barely getting by. So now you look at the depth chart and it seems like they went from a position of no depth to a position of strength. So while these guys aren't absolutely loaded, you're not going to say this is the best group in the entire league. There's a lot of potential here. So Rashad Bateman, former first rounder, just hasn't been able to stay healthy. Zay Flowers, like Caleb mentioned, Odell Beckham, there's some talent there. There's some different dynamics. Bateman's a larger guy. Zay Flowers is small, speedy, fast, quick, mismatch kind of guy. Then one move that I also like that they added was Nelson Aguilar. Not the biggest, showstopper out on the field, but we saw him be effective with New England in spurts, and we also saw him be effective with Las Vegas
Yeah, Las
Yeah,
Vegas.
I guess they were Las Vegas still then. They weren't Oakland. So with the Raiders, so he's been a decent wide receiver as well, and he's the wide receiver 4
Yeah,
or wide receiver 5 behind Devin Duvernay.
which is the
So
best spot for him, to be honest.
absolutely, so he gets to. It's not like you're expecting Aguilar to carry your offense, so that's just a nice bonus piece to have. So you look at Todd Monken coming and kind of giving them a new look offense, and hopefully Lamar being healthy again. But Monken comes in known for his explosive plays, going with the no huddle and using his tight ends to create mismatches. So with that, you look at that offense, Mark Andrews, it seems like they're going to take some steps forward, and we're hopefully going to see some more consistent, better top end play out of this offense that we used to be uh, more of a normalcy, and now the last few years has kind of been a struggle.
Yeah, I've never been a big Lamar drafter, just for the fact of we've seen some injuries affect his play and such, and Tyler Huntley taking over those roles, but Lamar finally now where he doesn't have to, and he's always going to run the ball. He's going to take his opportunities when he get them, but where he can rely a little bit more on his wide receivers, I think that's going to relax that ability for him to actually push the ball down the field with running. So
Mm-hmm.
could potentially see less injuries there, which it's only better beneficial long term for him. So yeah, so there's a lot of other free agency guys we could cover who we think were winners as well. We just wanted to highlight some main guys that we thought, because we don't want to have us sit here all day and talk about every single person who won. So
Yeah.
um, we're getting to some of our traded ones. Like we said, besides the Aaron Rodgers trade, there wasn't a whole lot of big polarizing trades in the NFL, and especially like on draft day, which is usually when you've seen them for the most part. Um, but one trade, kind of under the covers, a little trade, not a big one by any means, but could have some effect in when it comes to fantasy, was Elijah Moore. I believe it was Elijah Moore and a third traded to the Cleveland Browns for a second. So Moore, who was a second round draft pick originally in the NFL, we had talked about last year. Me and Garrett were both loving him. Flashed big time as a rookie, then got injured, which was unfortunate. And last year, really, really just, kind of didn't perform that well, but also was clashing with the team. Didn't get on the field for like the whole, I would say, 2/3 of the end of the season. He's barely playing, and but still, a young guy, polarizing prospect, and now comes into the Cleveland Browns wide receiver room, who really their main wide receiver last year was Amari Cooper, who went down as probably one of the steals of the trades last year in the NFL season, because they got him for a 5th-round pick last year, and he put up career numbers with Deshaun and Jacoby Brissett. But besides that, Donovan Peoples-Jones was the only wide receiver who really had any fantasy relevant, and he would be a flash in the pan for a week, take off a week basically. But he was pretty consistent, or pretty decent towards the end of the year, but not a true number 2. And now Moore comes into a room which had basically no slot wide receiver last year. Who was their slot last year, Garrett? Do you even know who it was?
I don't know. David Bell maybe played a little bit. Anthony Schwartz,
Yeah, I don't even know.
maybe, but like I don't know.
But
It was
Deshaun came back last year and looked a little rusty. But we've seen Deshaun be able to support a couple, one or two wide receivers at a time for fantasy relevant. And now Moore comes in, likely to take over the slot role. Could very well be the number 2 option on this team, where Watson's very well likely to improve this year, and honestly, kind of a high powered offense, to be honest. And you know he was nothing on the Jets for value if you would have looked at the team right now. And when he got traded, that really increased his value and possibility of becoming fantasy relevant again this year as well.
yeah. I think when you look at Elijah Moore, you're probably looking at somebody in the 100+ range. So more of your rounds 12 plus 10, 12 plus for most of your fantasy leagues. I think what I would like to highlight on there is going into the season last year, we were comparing both Elijah Moore and Amon-Ra St. Brown a lot. So both of those guys had flashes in their rookie seasons where they were really providing elite value. They had 6+ week stretches where they were really hammering the ball hard. They were putting up some great stats. And then going into last year, it was kind of the same thing. It was, questionable offenses, questionable transition periods. Was that the real deal, or the start of the season, how they started slow? Like, which one of these guys are going to pop off? Well, Amon-Ra St. Brown had a fantastic year last year. Elijah Moore obviously had his struggles, and it seemed like he was pretty vocal about it. Whatever situation he was thrown in, he was adamantly against it, and he was trying to. It seemed like he was trying to say online that I'm trying to work through it the best I can,
Yeah.
but I'm having some issues. Well, we all know there's divas in the league, and we don't get to see the full scope of what's going on. But he gets to start fresh here. And Deshaun Watson, being away from the team for so long last year and missing the season before, it's pretty understandable that he was going to start and have a rough outing in his first season.
I,
Um,
I guess one thing here, Garrett, that I wanted before you move on with more and hit on us, just kind of show that even though he put up a bad, like not too great of a fantasy relevant season, there's some underlying stats, I guess you can say, that in metrics that really actually end up leading to fantasy points in like a long term, which kind of will show that you can potentially be a breakout candidate. He was a top 45 in the NFL last year in route win rate. So a 44% chance in the route win rate. And then he was 72.7% success rate versus man coverage. So that's pretty high up in the league in the man rate win coverage. So he's winning on almost over 70% of his routes. So getting open on 70% of his routes in man coverage, which, like I said, especially the slot, that leads to usually, receptions in the long term, or at least more targets. So
yeah. And him being moved over here is a good situation too, because they already have Amari Cooper. So it's not like he has to come out and be the alpha. The way that team also moved the ball down the field last year, they were using David Njoku at the tight end position a lot. Their identity has always been through the run. So Nick Chubb is going to be leading the way. So it's, this offense, he doesn't need to come be a showstopper right off the get go. He can work into his role, get his confidence back, and then find a way to become a decent, like, fantasy supporting cast player. So, like we said, he's going to be a late round buy, kind of somebody who you could throw a dart at and see if he pops off. But good situation, good changing of the guard there, and we like what kind of how his offseason shaped up. On to our next guy. This guy is kind of in a completely different scenario. He's in the twilight of his career, and he transitioned from one team where he was the bona fide number one to a completely new situation where he doesn't have to be that guy. That's Brandon Cooks. So Brandon Cooks probably getting up there for most traded player in the league. But we saw him get moved from the Texans to the Cowboys this year. And what we like about this is that he gets to move into a situation where CeeDee Lamb is going to be the number one. That's pretty clear. He is a stud on the outside going into, what is it, his fourth season now? Third season? Yep. Yeah, third season. And he's really showed up as a player. So we have him, and Cooks can go there and be a supplemental receiver out on the field. Now, while that is great and nice, and he doesn't have to battle the number one corner, I think the biggest upgrade for him comes at the quarterback position, who the last several years he's been stuck with this middling mirage of whoever they're throwing in for the Texans, and Brandon Cooks is still gobbling up targets. Now he moves in with Dak, where he can be on the outside, he can create mismatches, use his speed, and be in a position where he can be successful fantasy again. It is the twilight of his career. He is getting a little bit older, but it is a great move for him to become fantasy relevant again and continue kind of that stretch and streak he was on.
Mr. Consistent. Cook's at, I think before last year, it was like 6 out of his 7 years before that, he reached 1,000 yards or something like that it was. So, and like you said, Garrett, when he was with the Texans, he was the bona fide one for the most part. But we've seen him excel early on in his career for like the first 4 or 5 years of his career. He was primarily used as a 2. With the Rams and with the Saints, he was not really the bona fide one on that team, and he still put up over 1,000 yards. And he's a big play waiting to happen sometimes. So, like I said, getting a little older, but we really haven't seen him slow down too much. Last year was just I'm gonna label it as poor QB play. So he was still having a high win rate and getting open, but just didn't quite get the ball where it needed to be sometimes. So
I just looked it up, and Brandon Cooks is the most traded player of all time. Yeah, him and 7 others have been traded 4 times.
Wow. So
wild.
One of our last segments here is we're gonna be talking about some guys who nothing really happened to change their value, and it actually increases their value because these are guys who potentially could have been either they could have had upgrades in the draft or in free agency or via trade, and nothing really happened to affect them. And they kind of put together some nice seasons last year. And our number one guy here on our list is Isaiah Pacheco. 7th round draft pick last year, went super late in drafts or picked up on waivers due to the preseason hype last year. And by week, I would say 7, he kind of molded himself into that RB1 role, mixed it in with McKinnon, who they did bring back, but the RB room is exactly the same as it was to end the year last year. RB1 Pacheco, McKinnon, and then CEH is still on roster. Kind of shockingly how he's been just dissolved away. But Pacheco was their guy down the stretch and into the playoffs. Put together a good game in the Super Bowl as well. And, he runs so hard. You look at him every time he runs, and it's just like his whole body just moves violently, and he hits the hole hard and all that stuff. And really, he's the only true running back on that team who really does that. McKinnon, we've seen used well in the passing game so far with Chiefs. Does break a big run every once in a while. McKinnon's like 30 years old, but he dealt with so many injuries early on in his career in the league, and he was a top prospect coming into the league and all this stuff. But he's put together stuff. But I think they know his role in the Kansas City Chiefs, and it doesn't really affect Pacheco's part of running the ball. Pacheco's not much of a pass catcher, but he was solid last year. And like I said, he was the feature back going into the playoffs, which shows a lot of confidence in him, in the team, in his role possibly moving forward.
Yeah, I think we were all beating our chests last year going into the season about how much we like Pacheco, but it was very, I guess, eye-opening to see that the Chiefs didn't do much to add to that running back room, which probably shows most of all that they're pretty confident in the 2 guys they have. I know that Jerick McKinnon last year had a really good stretch from week 13 on where he piled on the touchdowns through the receiving game every week. But it was still Pacheco through the playoffs, really getting the bulk load of the carries and kind of holding it down as the solo man in the rushing game. Pretty excited to see, and we're excited to see what he does again this year. The next 2 guys I'm going to lump together because they were both in similar situations. So Geno Smith and Jared Goff, both of them kind of came out unscathed through the offseason. Both of their teams held the 5th and 6th drafts or picks in the draft this year with, at the time we were looking at potentially 4 quarterbacks going in the first several picks. It ended up that Will Levis fell to the 2nd round. Both teams passed on quarterbacks. The Lions drafted Hendon Hooker in the 3rd round, but both the Lions and the Seahawks kind of gave these 2 guys a vote of confidence. Geno Smith gets a pretty lucrative deal this offseason, and they thought, maybe he could be one of the mentors for a guy like Anthony Richardson who could come in and sit behind him, or Jared Goff. The Lions could be looking for their heir apparent for their future. Well, they decided to go in the third round and wait till then, and instead they gave Jared Goff some more weapons, and instead Geno Smith got more
Yeah.
weapons. So last year Geno Smith was quarterback 5. They drafted a receiver in the first round, and Jackson Smith and Jigba, and then they draft a running back in the second round, and Zach Charbonnet. So after drafting a second round receiver last year, so both positions of strength. We see the Seahawks pile on and get some talent in that offense to help Geno do exactly what he did last year, and that was succeed. He was, QB5 in the league. He had over 4,200 passing yards, uh, and he had 30 touchdowns, which I think was fourth or fifth in the league. Great stats out of him. And then Jared Goff had a pretty darn good season last year too. He was QB10. He had 29 passing touchdowns, which was fifth in the league, and he had 4,400 passing yards, which was more than guys like Josh Allen. Kind of a wild, eye-opening stat there to hear, but those two guys had a pretty decent seasons, and I think some of it goes unnoticed. But you're probably looking at two guys who most likely going into the year you would have thought that they would have been kind of on the outs and the teams would be ready to look towards the future in a different direction, and instead they doubled down with the guys that they have.
Yeah, I like you said, it's how much we heard about how those two could potentially be replaced in the draft before the draft was, crazy, because both of them had 2 high first round picks, and they could have easily made a move to go up and get one of their guys, but they didn't. They sat, took the value when it dropped to them, and then added to these guys, basically building around them a little more, which you basically hammered home there. And it was kind of funny because, like I mentioned, it was just like you expected one of them to get replaced, and neither of them really. Hendon Hooker, third round, that's not great draft capital for a QB to eventually replace the guy. So that's basically a high value backup.
Also, it's not like they just held the 5th and 6th overall picks in the draft. Those picks they got from trades. They were from the Rams and from the Broncos. Both teams had 2 first round picks to play with, and they decided to manipulate them and use them in different ways. It's just, it was comical to see because it just wasn't expected.
Yeah, exactly. So our last winner here in the no change really value is a guy who 80s P right now is not really reflecting. And it's funny because he's kind of been a bell cow for 2 years in a row now. And he's last year he was drafted low because everybody was scared of Chase. No, not Chase Edmonds. Who was it that they? I can't remember, but his value was pretty low last year to begin with in the draft, and it's low again, and it makes no sense, kind of. And that's James Conner. He's kind of been a bell cow, actually, kind of the whole point of his career since he's taken over for Le'Veon Bell. And Garrett and I were talking about it. He finished the end of the year last year like really good. Was RB5 through the last 6 or 7 weeks of the year last year in PPR and standard. So
from week 10 to 17, he was the RB5 in half PPR. So he was ahead of guys like Najee Harris, Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, Ezekiel Elliott, Aaron Jones, Miles Sanders, Nick Chubb.
And
he was ahead of all those guys.
And he's in a team right now who I think they are projected for right now. They're projected to take dead last in the NFL, I believe, and it's because Kyler Murray tears his ACL towards the end of last year. Don't quite know when he'll be ready yet, and their kind of whole setup right now is like, they absorbed a lot of picks in the NFL draft for the future years. It kind of seems like they're set up for a rebuild, but they have nothing in the RB room besides Connor. It's the exact same as last year again. Keontae Ingram is at RB2, I believe, right now. And, there's not a whole lot of depth there behind. I don't think they added anybody of real value. And like I said,
Mm-hmm.
Murray's out. So they're going to be starting the week 1 through who knows how long, maybe week 4, week 5, with Colt McCoy or Clayton Tune, a rookie. It's one of those two. It sounds like it's going to win. And both of them not passing, not really big passing offenses. They cut DeAndre Hopkins and, are left with kind of a weaker wide receiver room right now. And it's like, it's just rounding out for Connor to get touches. He's gonna see the ball. He's gonna get his touches in. We know he can catch the ball in the backfield. We know he's good in the goal line work. So if they get down there, he's probably gonna be their guy for at least the start of the season.
Yeah, he's got a really exciting opportunity to step up and just be the guy who he's always been in terms of what we've seen fantasy
Yeah.
wise. He's easily overlooked, and he's like just one of these guys that everybody forgets about and writes off every single year. But he ain't writing back. All right, so we have some recent news out there about players who just benefited from some cuts. Caleb just mentioned that DeAndre Hopkins was cut, so we're going to highlight Hollywood Brown a little bit. Uh, Going into last year, he had moved and was traded from the Ravens to the Cardinals. Um, Definitely a different situation, as Caleb expressed, with the quarterbacks changing the guards. But through the first 6 games of the year last year, before Hopkins came in and before Brown went down with an injury, he was the wide receiver 6. So he was playing very well. He was showing that he could be the alpha and the solo guy in that offense with some ancillary pieces and guys like Greg Dortch
Yeah.
and some other randoms kind of coming in, following in line. They have Rondale Moore still playing more of the slot role, the small guy. Zach Ertz and Trey McBride, the rookie tight end from last year, coming back as well. So, expect bigger things from Hollywood Brown in that offense. Again, without Kyler there, it could be tough sledding to start. But that team, like Caleb said, isn't expected to win many games. So we could also see some garbage time where they're trying to move the ball down the field, and we get the bend don't break defenses where they're just saying, hey, as long as these guys don't put up a long touchdown, we'll give them the garbage dump offs all day long. We could see some extra PPR points thrown Brown's way that other teams might not get the opportunity for.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. The biggest question with Brown last year going into it was, he was a high trade in that draft last year for the wide receivers when we saw all those guys getting traded. And we didn't know if he could be the alpha. We didn't know. We knew Hopkins was going to be out the first 6 weeks of the year last year due to suspension. And like you said, he clearly showed he can be an alpha. He was getting I think he was averaging 12 targets a game. It was just nuts. And, racking in the yards, and, Hollywood's been a smaller guy for the most life, but he showed up that he could be their guy. And, when Kyler returns, I mean, expect a plentiful amount of targets coming his way. So we just don't know when Kyler is going to return. That's the biggest question mark going into the offseason and just football in general. But RKO.
Yeah. Through those 6 weeks last year, he was fourth in the league in targets.
Yeah, that's alpha numbers. So
Mm-hmm.
our last guy here, and I just want to put this out there right away. I'm not all into buying this guy quite yet, but you got to label him as a winner because, going in, we didn't know what his fantasy value was going to be this year, and that's Alexander Madison. He's been always one of the top handcuffs when it comes to fantasy football, because Dalvin always seemed to miss quite a few games every year, and Alexander Madison always seemed to, be productive in those games. And he signs a 2-year, $7 million contract in the offseason with the Vikings, and it was kind of head scratching because it was well, he just signed up to be the backup again. Well, Dalvin gets cut. They couldn't find a trade candidate. Dalvin gets cut. Right now, that backfield is Alexander Madison, Ty Chandler, Nini Nguagu, and Dwayne McBride, a 7th-round pick. All 3 of those guys, besides Madison, were 6th or 7th-round draft picks in the running back spot. So Madison was a 2nd-round pick by the Vikings years ago, but he's never been really heavily used. But one thing that really stuck out is he averaged almost 20 points a game when he's been given the RB1 role. So when Cook's been out, he's been averaging RB1 numbers, about 20 points a game. That would be putting him in that RB5 to RB3 range, which is not saying it's going to carry over long term, but we've seen him be when he's taken over, it's been just him. They don't ever mix anybody
Mm-hmm.
else. He's been the third down, or the three down back. And so far, all we've been hearing talk about is Kevin O'Connell says that they see Madison as being a three down back. What we've seen him be in those little flashes is what we're likely to see. Yes, we don't know what he can do with a full season of work. We don't know if he can stay healthy. He's dealt with injuries too in his career, but right now you got to consider him a winner because in a world where has been so much running back by committees, he's sitting alone at the top with nobody really near him right now in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's got a lot of opportunity in front of him, and I think it's pretty clear for anybody who's been in the fantasy spectrum the last few years. Since Madison came into the league, all games that Dalvin Cook's been out, he's been given 100% of the workload. So while, like you said, he's not going to take every single carry there is, it's probably going to be the vast, vast majority, and it's probably going to be one of the biggest bell cow loads out of the whole league, where now more and more than ever we're seeing committee
Yeah.
backfields. All right, so that kind of wraps up our biggest section of today, talking about the winners of the offseason. There, like Caleb said, there's a ton of guys out there who have moved into better situations, but these are kind of some fun ones to highlight and some different categories of, different ways that guys have gotten the bump. But what we want to touch on now, without going into too much depth and making it a whole nother episode, is just a couple guys who've been on the other side of the coin. So some fantasy losers. I'll start it off with the first one because I talked about the other side of it. Bijan Robinson goes to the Falcons. Tyler Algier, who had a pretty darn good rookie season last year, gets the bump down after in a different scenario. Had Robinson not gone there, Algier would have been a nice kind of premium pick in probably the round 2-3 range, where you're looking at like, hey, this guy could take that step forward in that bell cow role. Now he's second fiddle.
It just proves though that draft capital matters so much when it comes to the running back room. A guy literally puts up 1,000 yards, averages one of the highest yards per carry in the NFL last year, and gets bumped down to a role we don't quite know what it's going to be, but it's going to be quite diminished. So,
Yeah.
okay, these are two guys who have been literally fantasy staples at the wide receiver room basically their entire careers. And it's sad because it's so tough to gauge where to draft them at right now. I feel like they're going too high at their current ADPs, but also too low. Like, that's the way I feel like. It's like, oh, these guys are great. Oh, I really don't want anything to deal with them, though. Like, that's the way it is. It's just like, and that's Mike Evans and Chris Godwin's. Mike Evans, 9 straight seasons in a row of 1,000 yards. Chris Godwin, been putting up with Tom Brady and pre-Tom Brady. Looked like for a while they were one of the best wide receivers in the league. Both these guys have been staples at the wide receiver 1/wide receiver 2 on your roster for the past 4 or 5 years. You can say, well, Evans longer, but both of them at that 4 or 5 years staples.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them now are right around that wide receiver 30 ADP, and it's just like I said, it's like you're drafting them as a late wide receiver 2 to high wide receiver 3, and it's like, yeah, they both can obviously do that, but their quarterback situation, they go from Tom Brady, who was averaging roughly 40 some passes a game, and the most pass heavy offense in the league last year with the worst running offense in the league, to now either Baker or Kyle Trask with an offense that, with either of these quarterbacks, it's like you don't expect them to throw more than 30 passes a game. Baker has thrown the most interceptions in the league in the past 3 years with 3 or 4 years with 64 interceptions. He leads the league. He's got one of the worst completion percentages, and then otherwise you got Trask, who was a higher second round draft pick a couple of years ago, been able to learn underneath Brady, but couldn't beat out Blaine Gabbert the past 2 years as backup. He's been QB3 on the roster. not a lot of confidence going into the season with either of those guys. It's just like you know the talent's there.
No,
You know that the pedigree is there. It's just, are they going to get the ball thrown to them enough to be able to, really keep their high level of fantasy appeal?
absolutely. And like you said, it's going to be a situation where in the fourth and fifth round, you're going to be like, these guys shouldn't be here. I don't want to take them. It's scary for how productive these two have been, and both of them have been top three, top five in different seasons. And it's just a weird situation with them and Baker
Who
Mayfield
knows?
coming to
Who
town.
knows though? We could
I'm
have the whole situation last year with Gino. DK and Tyler Lockett, both of those. I don't think so. I'm not saying that's gonna be, but you just never know.
That's a tough one. Another guy that we can highlight is Ryan Tannehill, who put together some good seasons with the Titans. But we saw Will Levis get drafted early in the second round, and now it kind of seems like they're spelling for the end. Last year they drafted Willis in the third round. Very different player, but last year Tannehill had several starts where he wasn't in there. Um, I think it started with a injury and then ended up with a
Yep.
benching. Yeah. Um, and then they were just kind of seeing how the season played out at the end there. But it sounds like Tannehill is getting ready to be put up into the backup role and put to
Even
pasture. So Will Levis kind of turning the tide there
you
and
know, even if
changing the guard.
Tannehill is to be the full season as the starter, that wide receiving core in general is just, it's got to be the worst in the league. Up there. It besides Treylon Burks, I don't know who. There's Chig. Chig, showed some flashes at the tight end, and but for him to be the number two guy in the depth chart for basically receiving is scary, because you got two rookies right there, and then I don't
Mm-hmm.
who is their wide receiver two right now? Nick Westbrook-Akine, Kyle.
Yeah,
That's like, yeah.
I think so.
Neither of those. We've seen Westbrook-Akine be the number two, and it's not pretty.
Caleb, it's our boy Kyle Phillips.
Which, yeah, a fifth round draft pick, also a rookie last year. So,
Yeah.
Tannehill not given a whole lot to work with there, and we'll just hope Derrick Henry carries that offense alone still one more year.
One more year.
All right, a guy who Garrett and I were kind of high on last year. Put together an unreal fantasy season in 2021, put up wide receiver one numbers, and last year just dealt with injuries throughout the whole season. Basically, it seemed like got a big contract in the offseason. They brought in Devontae Adams. That's Hunter Renfrow. He is getting buried. They bring in Jacoby Myers, who is basically Hunter Renfrow, same position, all that stuff. And after a season, after the year they give Renfrow in 2021, they gave him a 3-year contract, roughly $12 million a year. And then they basically do the same exact contract for Jacoby Myers, who, like I said, is basically the same type player. Slotty guy, gets open, not going to, take the top off the team, but will get you, 90 to 100 yard or receptions in a season. And it's not only that they bring in Jacoby Myers, it's the fact that they got Jimmy G as a quarterback, who then again never has been a guy to throw 40 passes a game, 35 passes a game for even that matter. Usually right around 30. So it's not looking too good for Renfrow right now to be in that wide receiver 3 role, and on an offense that isn't going to throw that ball that much, and has a true alpha in front of him in Devontae Adams, the best, one of the top 3 wide receivers in the NFL still, and then to bring in Jacoby, like I said, who they're going to be competing for the receptions, is just, it's kind of ugly for Hunter Renfrow, and you're hoping he gets traded somewhere if because everyone that's watched the game knows
Yeah.
Hunter Renfrow he's been pretty consistent over his career. Then they had that one big blow up year in 2021. So
Yeah, and there's also I've seen videos out there of different players around the league giving Renfro a lot of credit
a
for
route
him
runner.
being a
Yeah.
better player. It's it's too sad to see because he's just kind of getting phased into the back when he should have been an elite number 2 last year after the year he had the
Yeah.
season before. At this point, with Jimmy G's injury, not knowing kind of how the season's going to start, I would love to see Renfro released and find a new home, but I don't think
No.
that's going to happen. All right, so the last guy we have on our list was a bona fide kind of first rounder projected guy, and now it's looking a little murky. So Ken Walker, pretty good player last year, right? Pretty good guy. He had a great
Had the draft
season.
capital.
We
Yeah.
like good draft capital. He was the second running back off the board going into the season last year. When he was given the ball, or when he was given the starter role, he was putting up pretty much 100-yard games one after the next. And he had the second most 20-yard rushes in the league, despite having less than 100 attempts than most of the other guys at the top of the list. An explosive play waiting to happen. Now, what happens? Well, Zach Charbonnet gets drafted in the second round. I think it's just this weird, twisted philosophy that
there's no bell cow anymore.
Seattle has, where they just want to keep replenishing with high picks at the position. But it just diminishes his value some. He goes from a bridge first round pick to probably more of like a third rounder at this point.
And you don't feel really comfortable taking him there for the most part. It's like we haven't heard much about the offseason. We haven't heard what it's going to be, and it could very well be a 50-50 split, which is just like you said, for a guy like Ken Walker, who was in the conversation for Rookie of the Year last year, and really kind of excelled at that running back game and looked like the best running back after our post Brees Hall injury. It's just like when you saw when you like Charbonnet as a prospect, and you like him coming in, you're like, oh, wonder who's gonna land this big beefy bulldozer of a running back, and all of a sudden he goes, it's like, oh, he goes to Seattle where they already have the same guy. It's Ken Walker.
Wrecks his value and Walker's value.
But hey, Pete Carroll obviously doesn't care about fantasy football, so
nope, he does not.
So, guys, with that, Garrett, I think that's going to wrap up our episode, isn't it?
Yeah, that's pretty much it for the winners of the offseason. This year, we're going to kind of take a different stance on our schedule. We're going to try to highlight and make sure that we're just going over a lot more of the fantasy ADP values and players we like. I think last year we had a good chunk of the July-ish timeline that we were going over different divisions and kind of highlighting the teams overall. This season's going to be a little bit different. But next episode, we have early ADP values, which is, I think, a great way to start your season. Gives you some guys who you should check out early on and kind of target for later rounds who aren't quite slotted in where they should be yet. So we say ADP, but this is probably more of an expert consensus ranking at this point. So early slates, you can kind of feel them out, and you get guys like Mike Evans and Godwin who might be fourth round expected, but probably not getting taken right there. And then you get other guys who are projected sixth, seventh round that you think should probably be more of a fifth round pick. So really kind of a fun episode, a great way to start things off, and we're excited to bring it to you next week. All right, with that, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.